Hey everybody, thanks for joining the webinar this morning. Welcome to the 27 virtual NSX-V to NSX-T Migration Task Force. So let's go ahead and get started and take a look at a quick look at 27 Virtual's background. So if we go to that next slide there. So about 27 Virtual. So just a quick background on us. So our company started back in 2008. We got involved in NSX around 2014. We've been doing deployments of NSX-V since 2016 and T since inception. Recently, we've done as many T deployments as we have V and done a lot of migrations from V to T. So we've done all different types of NSX deployments on all different types of hardware, different types of server hardware, Cisco UCS, VxRail, HP, different types of underlying network infrastructures, whether it's Arista, Cisco, and we've seen a lot of different mixes and combinations of routing protocols and configurations. So we really focus on NSX, and we're really here to focus on the migration of NSX-V to NSXT. We're also a company that does core vSphere, we do vSAN, we do a lot of vRealize automation, and now modern application development. So one thing we're going to focus on in this workshop is how to migrate from V to T and the features of T. Another thing to point out that's important, as a VMware partner, we also participate in the Master Services Competency Program, where you can actually take VMware PSO credits and transfer those to 27 Virtual, and we can do those services for you. A couple of minor things. So this is a Zoom webinar, so we are recording the webinar. At the end of this webinar, we're going to shoot you out an email. There'll be a link to the recording of this. You can review this anytime you want. There are no open mics for the attendees. So if you have questions, just post your questions into the Q&A window, and our moderator will relay those questions to us. And as Brent Kaplan likes to say, you got to be in it to win it. So please fill out our survey. So when the webinar is over, a window is going to pop up, and you can just fill out that survey for a chance to win a $100 Amazon gift card. And if you have any questions at all, feel free to email info@27virtual.com, and we'll give you Brent Kaplan's email here at the end of the webinar. So again, our focus is how to migrate from NSX-V to NSX-T. So the big question is, why would we want to migrate to T? Well, the number one reason is there has been an announcement that NSX-T is going to be end of support as of January 16th, 2022. So that's the end of 2021. So that's not too far away. But more than that, all the new development features that are taking place in NSX are taking place in NSX-T. And if you look at this graphic, it shows you the VMware NSX portfolio. And we can actually see you have NSX Data Center, which is the core product that would work in your on-prem data center. There's NSX Cloud, which helps you extend NSX capability to native cloud platforms like AWS or Azure. There's another new feature that's built into NSX-T, which is NSX Intelligence, which is a really cool feature. It builds on the concepts of vRealize Network Insight, specifically for applications, and gives you the easy button to build those firewall rules. And now a new feature recently announced is the NSX Distributed IDS IPS feature, which is going to be built into NSX-T. So the way to look at this is all NSX-T. If you compare NSX-T to NSX-V, it's just that first box, NSX Data Center, which is a very strong product. I mean, it does a lot of really great things, but that's kind of where V sits. If you wanted all those additional features and capabilities, you're going to have to leverage T. The other thing to mention here also is NSX-T is going to support container workloads. So kind of the same idea, the box on the left where the VM workloads are shown, that's where NSX-V sits, vSphere VMs. And now with T, we also support container workloads, the ability to extend to the public cloud. We also have some new features from a security standpoint where we can actually place agents on not only Linux bare metal, but also Windows bare metal machines. So a lot of expanding features and capabilities with T, and then you couple that with this end of support announcement, and we have plenty of time to get ready. So we want to show you how to take that journey from V to T.
Yep. Hey, everybody. Andrew Grismore here. So What it sounds like is that if we're trying to move toward that goal of any application, anywhere, and in this case, any type as well, then we're looking at NSXT as the way to go.
Yeah, that's right, Andrew. So let's take a quick look at some new features specifically in 3.0. So there's a lot of features in general, but 3.0 specifically, there's a new feature called federation, which everybody's talking about. This is the ability to take two different data centers and federate them. So I can have a data center in Los Angeles and a data center in New York, and I can extend the network. But more than extending the network is we can do that now, but it gives us a simple way to do a failover from one to the other without requiring a bunch of manual configuration or scripting. And unified policy and security across all locations. So imagine you have something on-prem, and for example, VMware Cloud and AWS is T-based, so I could deploy NSXT on-prem, leverage NSXT in the cloud, and then I can federate them anywhere in the world. So that's very powerful. Best-in-class intrinsic security. So we have the distributed IDS, which is a great feature. You might be using something like Trend Micro Deep Security or some other tool. So this could actually replace that. Now that is a subscription-based model. And then as I mentioned before, NSX Intelligence, the ability to basically hit the easy button when it comes to creating firewall rules within the application space. Full support for modern networking and applications. That includes traditional containers like Docker containers or PKS type of environments. It also includes containers in vSphere. So I can take that container network interface and plug it into an NSXT segment, and I can't do that with V currently. And then the last thing, streamline operations. There is a feature in NSXT, which was mainly geared towards making sure that NSXT is hypervisor agnostic. It allows you to take that network and stretch it across to your KVM hypervisors. And it added a little bit more complexity from a network card configuration standpoint. We'd have to have like yet another switch called an NVDS. If you move all the way to vSphere 7 and you're on NSXT 3.0, you can now leverage what's called a converged VDS. And the converged VDS just makes it simpler to get the deployment done when we don't have to worry about having additional network cards maybe specific for that, and allows that step to migrate or move to T a little bit easier. So where to begin? Let's take a look and see how do we get from V to T. So V is a great product. If you're familiar with V, you understand the concept of, say, an edge services gateway, DLR, maybe a DLR control VM, the logical switches, maybe universal logical switches. There's also network services like load balancing, firewall in the edge. There's VPN capability. Then, of course, your workloads plug into those segments that you build and leverage those gateways and services. So we have to wait to take all these components and take them off the existing V segment onto the T segment, but we got to have the gateways and the services in place to do that. So these are the components that we would be migrating from V to T. Okay, so different strategies. So how are we going to do it? So VMware has got this really good tool called the Migration Coordinator. The Migration Coordinator will come with your NSXT deployment. So I'm going to deploy an NSXT manager or management plane, and I'm going to start up this Migration Coordinator service. It allows me to do an in-place migration. In order to do the migration, there are some requirements you have to meet and some prerequisites that have to be in place. And there's 5 specific topologies that are supported to be able to go through the Migration Coordinator without a hiccup. We can also do a coexist, lift and shift. That means I'm going to go buy some new hardware. I got some greenfield hosts I'm going to plug into, maybe a new network infrastructure underlying. And I'm going to deploy my NSXT manager and deploy my edges that I need initially. And I'm going to basically move things from one to the other. And then the last one here is this coexist. It's the same as the last one, but sometimes moving the workloads from one to the other can be challenging. So you can actually do the same as the middle coexist, but add on the HCX tool, which allows us to more easily migrate from, say, older versions of vSphere or from other storage platforms. And also in the middle there, there's a fling that VMware has that can also help you migrate workloads. And then the other thing that's important in the in-place migration, or one of the limits to the migration coordinator, is it doesn't understand universal objects or the north-south OSPF. And also in your firewall rules, if they're referencing, something that's universal or, something that's vSphere object-based, that can be a challenge as well.
So let's talk about some of those migration, in-place migration with the migration coordinator scenarios and prerequisites as we move forward.
Okay, so Andrew, what we're looking at here is the NSX for vSphere requirement. So you got to have a stable environment, kind of a no-brainer, right? Got to have that. Got to have NSX 644 or later. Most customers at this point should be there. Maximum of 64 hosts, and then you got to meet one of those 1 to 5 different topologies, which you're going to cover in a minute. And then vSphere requirements, no pending host reboots, compatible with T. So you got to be vSphere 6.5 or 6.7 or higher. DRS should be in manual mode so that things aren't moving around on us without us knowing about it when we go to start putting hosts into maintenance mode and planning for making changes. And then we do have to kind of prep the environment a little bit. So we have to have the NSX management cluster in place, and we do have to have the edges in place, and then we can kick off the migration.
All right, so let's take a look at some of those 5 specific topologies. And what we'll notice is that they're going to be fairly similar, and they're going to be fairly simplistic in terms of what we're seeing to match up with what the migration coordinator needs to be able to function. And like you mentioned, in our NSXT topology over here on the right-hand side, we're going to have to make sure that we have our NSXT manager ready to be able to do the migration with the migration coordinator, and some edge nodes ready to be able to take on the configuration and translate what we were doing from an edge and DLR perspective in NSX-V and turn that into the NSX-T components. So although we don't have all the time in the world in this webinar to go into exactly what tier 1s and tier 0s are and what they do, you'll see how they translate from the edge services gateway and distributed logical router in V to T. So let's look at topology 1. In topology 1, to be able to use the migration coordinator, if you match this topology, what we're looking at is our workloads down here at the bottom. They're plugged into their VXLAN logical switches, which have their gateway on a distributed logical router for that distributed routing functionality. And then you can see going north, we have our edge services gateways in HA mode. So in our active standby HA ESG mode with BGP connectivity to our north-south physical world. So what that would translate to as we use the migration coordinator would be a single tier 0 active passive utilizing the 2 edges that we have mode with BGP north-south in the NSXT environment. The cool thing is that even though we're going to a single tier 0, we're going to get our distributed logical router piece with the distributed router portion of the tier 0. And we're also going to take advantage of the active passive SRs or service routers that live in our edge nodes to establish the north-south connectivity out to the physical network. So we get our distributed routing functionality just like we have the DLR. We get our north-south functionality through the SRs and the edges, and that's what Migration Coordinator will translate that to in NSXT. And then we have topology number 2, and you'll see that this is very similar to the last one. The main difference that we're looking at here from the V side is that we're utilizing our edge services gateways in ECMP mode. So if we want higher availability, more bandwidth, if you remember from V, we could have up to that 8-way ECMP. Maybe we're utilizing multiple edges. So in this case, again, we have our DLR, we have our edges, and then BGP north-south. What that translates to with the migration coordinator is a single tier 0 with the DR and SR components, and those SR components live in our edges, and we're going to be using them in an active fashion from the tier 0 level. So that's essentially the equivalent of our ECMP from the V side.
And
Bill,
then
you want to talk about topology? Go ahead.
I got it. Topology 3. So in Topology 3, it looks very similar. We have the two edges. We're ECMP on the left, but it looks like this customer, Andrew, is in a multi-tenant environment, or they have some services they need. Because when you run an ECMP mode, a lot of you probably know this in V, when you're in ECMP mode, you can't have any stateful services. So no firewall, no load balancer in line there, no VPN services, no NATing, none of that kind of stuff, right? So if I wanted to do something like a stateful service below the ECMP edges, I have to stand up another set of edges. These would probably be in an active standby mode. And then below that, I would have my distributed logical router. So that's why that structure looks like that on the left. And that's pretty common. If I'm doing something with ECMP, I need to do some services, I put those edges there. And then at the very bottom, I have my segments that I built, my universal logical switch or my regular logical switch, and my workloads plug in. So we're going to migrate over to T. Again, we've met all the requirements, and we've got some things in place. We've got the management plane and the edges kind of standing up there. And we're going to be able to kind of plug those components into that as we migrate. So we're going to have the active edge nodes. We're going to have the SR component, which is going to be doing our north-south routing in that edge node. So you get a T0 with the SR components. You got the DR component, which is the router in the tier 0. And the reason we have that additional T1 at the bottom is so that we can support these services that we're bringing over that are in that edge services gateway. So that SR component where the green arrow is pointing on the bottom right there, that guy there is doing whatever that edge services gateway HA was doing on the left. So maybe they were doing a NAT or something of that nature. So we're substantiating this T1, and we're going to make sure that in the edge node, we have this SR component that does those type of services. And then we have the DR at the bottom, which is our T1 DR that does the routing. And then below that, we'll substantiate NSXT segments. And they'll be able to, in the very end, when all the stars are aligned, we'll take the VMs and we'll move them from the V environment and plug those VNICs into the new T segments. Looks easy enough. Now this one's interesting. Now look close on the left side. It looks very simple, like the very first one that we looked at. The only difference is on the bottom right corner there, there's a load balancer. So in V, you deploy a load balancer as an appliance. And it just sits as a VM out on your environment. And this is a one-armed example. So it's a one-armed load balancer that's been deployed. So when I go to migrate, in order to get that load balancer service, I'm going to need to substantiate an SR component again. So I'm going to get the T0 with my active edges from my ECMP, my SR components that are active. I get my tier 0, I get my DR for the tier 0. I get a T1 that does my routing, my DR, but then I also get an SR component, which is in the edge node. And that SR component is what's replacing the load balancer that we migrated. So again, you got to meet the prerequisites, all the requirements. You got to kind of build out the base environment to get everything ready. You got to kind of tee it up, if you will. Then you go through and you start up that migration coordinator service, and you go through a wizard, and it's going to look to see that everything here matches up. And if it does, we're going to be able to then migrate those components over, those services over, and then ultimately those workloads will plug into those networks. So Andrew, looks pretty simple.
Yep, and the Migration Coordinator is a really nice tool. If you meet this one of the last 4 topologies, or this last topology that we're going to look at here, it will actually take what you have and translate it directly in place to these NSXT objects. So the last example that we're going to look at here is an example where you may be utilizing your edges as a load balancer for some VLAN networks that are plugged into that edge. So let's say we're load balancing here in an active, passive, or HA format to our VLAN workloads, or they could be our overlay networks as well. They could be your VXLANs over here, but you could also do it with VLANs. And if you're in a scenario where you're plugged directly into the edge, then the coordinator, when you fire it up and you go through the checklist and say, do we match this topology? Yes, it will translate it directly to the active, passive, single tier 0, where you can perform those stateful services and provide those to your workloads that you have down here. Again, always BGP north-south. We've got to be exactly in these scenarios for the Migration Coordinator tool to work, but it is an option if you do match that up. So the question is, how do I be sure that I can use the Migration Coordinator? Well, if you answer a series of questions in the right way, and you match one of the 5 topologies that we just looked at, then you can use that tool. So if we want to use the tool, which sits over here, then we have to make sure that we answer all these questions correctly first. So the first would be, do we have NSX-V 644 or greater? So there's one of the prereqs. If the answer is yes, then we're on our first step to being able to use the Migration Coordinator. Then if our target environment is NSX-T 24 or greater, we got to make sure we deploy the managers out there, make sure that they are to the level where we do have the option to use the Migration Coordinator. Hopefully the answer is yes there. We're at 3.0 now. And then we hit our first real roadblock where we can talk about multi-site. So from 27 Virtual's perspective, many of our customers are multi-site. So they're using those universal objects. They may have multiple vCenters. You can have more than 2 vCenters. You could have multiple sites that you're using to stretch the networks across. And if you are in one of those multi-site scenarios, then unfortunately, you can't use the Migration Coordinator tool, and you're going to end up at one of these custom migrations. And that's why we created this webinar. For those of you who may not be able to use that Migration Coordinator and need to think about what a custom migration looks like if you're in one of those more complex deployments than what we saw in those previous 5 examples, or you don't meet the prerequisites, we actually created the 27 Virtual NSX-V to NSX-T Migration Task Force, where we have a group of guys dedicated to making sure that our customers have the best experience and the best strategy to do one of these migrations where you can't use that coordinator. So I'm the leader of that task force, and that's why we built this out, so that you guys can have an understanding of, if you need to do one of those custom migrations, you have a partner out there that has done many of these before already. We've done new stand-ups of T, we've done migrations, and we can help you get there. So if you end up there, that's why we exist. But if you can say, no, we're not multi-site, and we want to do an in-place upgrade, and you answer those correctly, you say, yes, I want to do an in-place upgrade, well, now you look at another question. So what about service insertion, Bill?
Yeah, a lot of our customers also are doing some type of service insertion. That means they have, typically it's a security plugin. So they may have something like Trend Micro Deep Security. It's probably one of the most common ones. So what you have to do is deploy these appliances across your environment. There's like a management plane and a control plane that lives across each host. And the first thing you have to do if you're using any kind of third-party service insertion is you need to check and make sure whether or not it is going to be compatible with NSXT. And even if it is, there's a no there. So once we make that switch, things just work a little bit differently in T. There would be some considerations there on how to continue to leverage that third-party service insertion, whether it's for network introspection, like the Palo Alto integration, or the regular client introspection, like a Trend Micro Deep Security. In either case, we have to come up and do kind of some custom planning for you because the configuration might be a little bit different. There's a few nuances there where we have to make sure that is built out correctly that can support, you know, that flip over at that point. So there are some considerations there with third-party service insertion.
Yep. So we got to think about multi-site. We got to think about service insertion. And if we're in those scenarios, we're probably thinking about a custom migration. We also want to consider if we have extra hardware available, because this is an in-place migration. If we want to make that available on the extra hardware, we have to think about that. We have to understand that there is going to be a maintenance window. So there will be downtime in terms of moving from V to T with the coordinator. So we have to be okay with that and say, yes, we're okay with a maintenance window, so that we can say, okay, now do we match one of the 5 topologies that we just talked about? And if the answer is yes, then you can use the Migration Coordinator. So while the Migration Coordinator is a really great tool, and if you do get to the point where you can use it, it will help you move to T. You may have to do some peeling back of the onion to get to one of those topologies and make it match up to what it needs to be. But if you are in a scenario where you're here, or here, and you're left scratching your head a little bit saying, well, I'm not even really sure what these NSXT components are, or how everything is going to translate, or how to make our multi-site design work in the NSXT world, how do I get there? Again, that's why we created the task force, the V to T migration task force from 27 Virtual, to actually help you get there and build out that plan so that you're not left scratching your head. And on top of that, we actually have a really cool couple of guests that we're about to introduce here from ReSTNSX, who's a partner with 27 Virtual in the task force to help customers get there easier, that are going to show you a tool that they've created specifically to aid in V to T migrations. DJ, you want to take it from here?
Absolutely. Thank you guys very much. DJ Antonucci with ReSTNSX. We also have Johnny Bailey in the room here. And we are a company, a software company focused on obviously V to T, but also other aspects of just NSX management in general, being V or T. We're trying to deliver the easy button to our partners and customers for migrating from V to T. So all those obstacles that Andrew pointed out on that last flow chart, our goal is to try and alleviate as many of those as possible so you guys can focus on architecture, design, getting your all those benefits of NSXT up and running instead of the process of getting to V to T, which is where we overcome. So one of the strategies we take, which is relatively unique in our opinion, is that we take a life cycle approach to a migration. And what we mean by that is that we're not only looking at the migration process, we're looking at the NSX-V environment before the migration to see what optimizations can be had using other ReSTNSX tools. We're looking at things like rule duplication, object duplication, stale objects in your environment. So before you even move to T, what optimizations can be made. Then the second step of that process is using the MAT tool, which we're about to show you here, so V to T, and all the optimizations we do there, and all the obstacles that we overcome in that last flow chart, like unsupported objects. That's a great example that we'll show you. We support universal, we support multi-site, we support all those vCenter objects that Bill was referring to at the beginning. So we take and give you that easy button, and you don't have to think about the migration, just go through the process. The third step of that life cycle is what we call the post-migration, which is once you're on T, the tools that ReSTNSX has to offer for not only looking at the new T environment, but documentation. And then the last step is that part of the life cycle where I could roll back and do this all over again if I wanted to, without impacting my NSX-V environment at all. So on the screen, you see a bunch of bullets, and these are our true differentiators versus Migration Coordinator or custom scripting, or really any other approach out there, which we're going to go through in detail over the next 15 minutes. So with that said, I'm going to introduce Mr. Johnny Bailey, and we're going to jump into the demo.
Cool. Hey guys, hope everything is going well. If you have questions, please just chime right in. We are going to have some questions and answers after we're finished, but if you do have some questions while we're going along the way, instead of making you wait, just please feel free to chime right in and we'll answer it.
Yep. But I'm going to end my screen sharing here. And as I do end my screen share, as we move over to the demo for the MAT tool from ReSTNSX, I have a question for you guys. And we're going to actually post a poll as we transition into the demo. And the question is, how many of you actually meet the requirements to be able to use the Migration Coordinator tool? So Brian, if you want to go ahead and post that poll while we transition, I'll stop sharing. You guys can go ahead and share your desktop, but I want to get a quick feel from the audience of who actually is able to take advantage of this Migration Coordinator. Do you meet all the prereqs, and do you meet one of those 5 scenarios, so that we can get a better understanding of where our customer base is at? Awesome. So feel free to answer the question. We'll give you about 20 more seconds here to say, do you meet the requirements? And then we'll take a look at the results, and then we'll check out this demo. All right, Brian, I think we're good. Awesome. And yeah, that's probably about what we would expect. So let's check out the MAT tool demo from ReSTNSX. And with that knowledge in mind that, hey, maybe we don't meet those requirements, we've got to think about our slightly more complex environment and how we would move from V to T.
Yeah. So real quick, for some reason, Andrew, it's saying our screen share is paused. Do you see our desktop?
I do see it, but it does look like it's paused for whatever reason. I stopped sharing, so.
Do you see us clicking through the tabs?
No.
Oh, okay. You know what? I'm just going to share.
Oh, here we go.
Sorry about this.
Share desktop.
All right.
There we go.
Is that better?
We should be good, right?
We're good.
All right. Sorry about that.
Hey, thanks, guys. I appreciate you guys taking the poll also. So just to recap, we're going to walk through a demo of what it does to take us from, NSXV to NSXT, the simplicity of it. If you try to use the migration coordinator, I think you'll probably run into a lot of complexity as was described throughout, most of this call. And you'll also probably run into some limitations on use cases that you have. Some really big reasons of why we created this tool. I mean, obviously, this tool has a cost associated with it, whereas the migration coordinator is something that comes for free in NSXT. So we always get the question, why did we go create this? And I think the number one answer is 90% of the customers we're talking to, the migration coordinator does not meet the requirements that they have for migration. The number one reason is if you have, and that was outlined during the presentation, is if you're using cross vCenter and you're doing universal objects, or if you have more than one vCenter or NSX-V manager and vCenter pair, you can't use the tool. You can only migrate one at a time. You can only migrate one NSX-V source to a single T source, and any additional V source will be a manual migration. So, you imagine in larger environments or even small environments, when you have a few hundred objects and there's dependencies and, or in some of our customers, they have thousands of objects and they have hierarchies of dependencies. You have a problem with one object, it could impact the whole system. One rule out of order can cause a big problem. One rule skipped in scripting due to an error can cause the whole environment to be down. So we're talking about migrating something that is existing as the fabric of your whole data center. So very important. So one, we will do multi-V to T. If you're looking at the tool right here, what this is it's just an OVA. It takes literally 5 to 10 minutes to install, and you're looking at this page. And the only thing you'd have to do is add data sources. Each data source represents an individual NSX-V instance. So here we have 2 separate V instances going to the same T instance. Now, we have the ability to do many V to many T, many V to single T. We don't put limitations and constraints on what our customers designate that they want. The other thing we're going to do is we're going to take, we're going to give you a whole bunch of options here. So after you've added your data source, you really have these things we call migration options. And this is where the real magic happens, because we've got the ability to do things like, and I'm going to talk through them as we do the migration just for the sake of time, is, if you have things that aren't supported in T, we're not just going to stop and say, go fix these 1,000 things that are not supported in T. Like if you're using cluster in the source of a firewall rule or data center or just something that might not be supported in T. We got customers with thousands of firewall rules. The T migration coordinators flagging hundreds, if not thousands of items for them to go fix. That's going to take months to happen. We're going to say, hey, let's flag it. Let's show it to you, which you'll see here on the next screen, but also give you the option to actually not have to go fix it yourself. We know what you're trying to do, so we're going to take an intent-based approach, meaning if you've got a cluster in the source of a firewall rule, instead of just stopping and saying, go fix this, we'll say, hey, this isn't supported. You may want to move it to something else, but if you don't, we'll move it for you. We know what you intend to do. You want every VM in that cluster to be the source of a firewall rule. So why don't we move that into either an IP set or put the VMs, if its scale is okay, into a source security group or NS group. We're going to take care of that heavy lifting for you so that at the end of the day, you're going to have an equivalent migration. So these other settings you see here is we're going to give you the ability to pick between advanced API or policy API. You can mark or append names to objects on the way. You can store the way that objects are associated with each other, like security groups and security tags, by VM name versus VM object ID. This is important if you're going to a whole new vCenter. These are things that the T Migration Coordinator does not support, but we do. So if you wanted to, we have customers who have asked, service providers and others that said, hey, if we want to be able to move to a whole new vCenter, give us, a way to do that the T Migration Coordinator can't do. It's an in-place migration. At the end of the day, you will be NSXT. So we'll go ahead and hit next. And we're going to hit begin data collection. What we're doing right now is measuring their environment. We're collecting everything. You're going to see errors here. We've planted errors. There's going to be things that say, hey, this isn't supported, we're skipping it, or it's not used anywhere. We'll even try to optimize it along the way, meaning if you've got an IP set that's not used anywhere in NSX-V, we'll unselect it because it's not being used anywhere. And we'll give you the ability to also do a selective migration, another thing that the T Migration Coordinator doesn't do. As you can see, we can unselect or select objects along the way. So maybe you don't want to move everything. Maybe you only want to do security, or maybe you don't want to do this batch of ESGs. You really have the full flexibility to select and unselect everything you want to migrate. Now, another thing we're going to do is we're not an in-place migration like Migration Coordinator. Migration Coordinator, it basically kicks off, and at the end of the day, all of your VMs are on T. If you have a problem along the way, and we've had customers who have had these problems, it's basically a call to GSS for 15 hours to fix it, right? Or whatever that time frame is to get it resolved. That's a big issue. When you're dealing with something that runs at the fabric of your data center and it has a problem along the way, while it's migrating and there's no real rollback mechanism, it's scary, right? That's just the worst case situation, but you've got to plan for the worst case. For us, we do it much differently. We do the management plane only. We only migrate the management plane, meaning at the end of the day, you can have V and T up at the same exact time. We will have migrated all the configuration over. V is still in its original state with all the hosts still prepared for for V. And if you want to migrate the hosts when you're ready, you just go to NSX, you go into the installation tab, unprepare the cluster for NSX-V, just uninstall it from the host preparation tab, and then go to T, and then prepare it. So it's very easy for us to move hosts between V and T, so you can have both up at the same time, move some hosts over to T, test it, play with it, feel comfortable with it, and if you're not comfortable with it, move it back to V. So going back and forth between V and T is very easy, plus we can do a rollback, or per data source rollback. And if you're looking at these rules, we're going to show you some rules that have objects in it that just aren't supported in T. For example, you see data center, you see cluster, and the source and destination and apply to. This rule set that we have here is representative of almost every possible knob you could have configured. We also do the same thing in the topologies, right? You got a nice snapshot of what the Migration Coordinator supports from a topology perspective. But we're going to more closely align to both best practices, the NSXT best practices design guide, as well as the topology that you had in place before. If you got single ESG, single DLR, standalone, you may have done something with app isolation or whatever with VRA. If you got DLR connected to active standby ESG, DLR connected to active standby, then to ECMP in a multi-tier design, or directly to ECMP, we are not going to limit your design. We are going to take exactly what you had, and it's going to look almost identical to that functionally. From a packet flow perspective and services perspective, you will get the functional equivalent, whether it's firewall rules, load balancing, NAT, routing, whole 9 yards. We won't require you to move, or halt just because you have OSPF configured. We'll even try to move your OSPF and convert it to an equivalent BGP configuration. We can look at the OSPF neighbors and say, you know what, you're probably going to be configuring the same neighbors. They're probably, Cisco devices, Arista devices, whatever it might be. You'll probably be using those same VIPs or VLANs or whatever you're peering with. Let's configure those as BGP neighbors for you. So we'll even try to migrate configurations that are just totally not supported. The other thing is, as you can see, the collection just finished. We seeded in some warnings and errors, so we can show you how we handle those things. This screen represents the collection. We can also export this. This is another differentiation from Migration Coordinator. We can stop, export the data, and if we click that export button, we get a JSON file that we can then import back into the migration tool somewhere offsite, or in your lab, and do a migration to a completely different disconnected T manager that has no connection back to your regular network where your V manager exists. So my ability to actually go in and do migrations offline are really, really powerful as well. So we're going to review transformations. What this does is it's going to go in and show you, here's what we're going to do with the data. We showed you what we collected, but here's what we're going to do after we collect it. And if you notice, we're going to do things like show you recommendations. We're going to move migration configuration. We're going to give you a recommendation inside, and we'll give you a PDF summary of this report, which basically is a pre-migration report. We haven't migrated yet. We're just showing you, here's what your source data look like in V. When we're finished with the migration, here's what it's going to look like in NSXT. Now, going over to look at NSXT, just so you don't think it's smoke and mirrors, right? We're going to show you that it should be pretty blank. We got no tier 1s, no tier 0s, no segments. DFW should be pretty empty. There may be a rule here or there. Yeah, looks like there's one rule, one section that one of our developers created, but doesn't have all those other firewall sections. So we're going to go ahead and begin a migration. And this process, just from a timing perspective, typically takes somewhere between 5 minutes and 45 minutes. This is an environment where we have a few hundred roles. We've got, a dozen or so ESGs and DLRs. We've got a few dozen, 2 or 3 dozen, logical switches. Obviously, a few DV port group, VLAN back to DV port groups as well on the VDS and vCenter. So we're going to show you that we're going to migrate absolutely everything, right? And this, for our environment, it's only going to take about 3 minutes. I think in a larger environment, it typically takes much longer. So if you look at the data we just migrated, it's still going through the migration right now. But once it's complete, we're going to have an equivalent NSXT configuration, and we didn't stop and require you to take any action. We were able to say, hey, you know what? These things aren't supported. You may have to go do this after the fact. It's going to be about 5, 10, 15, 30 minutes of work. Very small stuff that team maybe just doesn't support, and you have to work around it, right? Like, for example, ICMP type and code of IP encap is supported in NSX-V. It's not supported in NSXT. We're not going to relax security in our intent-based approach. We're going to call it out and say, you know what, this is just flat out not supported. You've got it configured. You might want to do something with that. So we're going to give you a report afterwards that includes those things. It should be very small. Our typical migration is probably 5 to 10 items. And in those items, in this one, you can see we've seeded a whole bunch because we wanted to create errors. So we've got 9 in this environment. But those 9 things out of thousands is minimal, right? Okay, I need to go figure out, instead of doing ICMP type and code of IP encap between these 2 VMs only, why don't I just do all of ICMP, right? So you're going to have to make those decisions because we're not going to relax your security in our environment. So if you look at here, we've got the rules. They've already started populating in. The migration should be close to done, if not done already. We picked policy, so we moved things in NS groups for you. We put into an equivalent NSXT configuration. This is identical, right? We can go select the gateway firewall that we have that has the ESG services on, that had all those firewall rules. This is an equivalent configuration. So if you tried to do this with the migration coordinator, you wouldn't even be able to begin the migration for a long period of time. I can assure you, if you just go try it out, you're going to see hundreds of items, if not thousands, depending on how large your environment is, of things you're going to have to go fix before you can even begin the migration. In this environment, we showed you everything that was wrong. We proceeded with migration. It converted into an intent-based approach, everything that didn't support, and we were able to get there. So you see everything there. I know we want to leave around 15 minutes for questions and answers. We're right at the top of that time. So if you guys have questions, please call it out. This is a very easy thing to demo, very easy thing to run in your environment. The one thing we didn't show is when it completes in the next 12 seconds or 30, 40 seconds, is we can do a complete rollback as well. So when all the configuration is created, when we're ready, we can just roll the whole configuration back. So very simple process to do. This is probably the easiest way to do an NSXT migration. And we also, through our partnership with 27 Virtual, we do this as a service as well. We can come in and just make the migration very easy, do a lot of reporting for you as well to get your environment converted over to T.
Yeah, and part of that whole life cycle approach that we were talking about earlier is that, obviously we just did the migration, and then there's tools within the other ReSTNSX family that can help look at the T environment, validate things along with 27 Virtual. So at this point, we're fully migrated to the new T environment. We're not going to go over there and look through everything, but we kind of gave you a sampling. But two things to wrap up. We mentioned the rollback, which we'll do at the end here. But as far as doing things after the fact, so at this point, to Jami's comment earlier around, our hosts are still in the V environment, and we allow you to migrate at your pace. The idea is that you can move your hosts over a one by one, cluster by cluster, whatever it is. You come back into our tool and do something called a post-migration task, which would allow you to reassociate those VM memberships to the security group, security tag, whatever it may be of the destination environment. Because at this point, you move your host over, T can now see the inventory, and we can reassociate by VM ID or a VM name in the environment out there. So we give you that self-paced migration as well. So for the sake of the demo, we're going to roll back and open up the floor to questions.
Yeah, I got a couple of questions out here. I see one question is, can we use VMware credits for ReSTNSX?
Through 27 Virtual, yes.
And how is ReSTNSX licensed?
Good question. So we have two different license models. So ReSTNSX, this MAT product, is licensed based upon number of NSX-V data sources. So if I'm going from 12 NSX managers to one T manager, that'll be 12 licenses of our platform. There's another option where it's baked into our ReSTNSX platform, which we didn't show you today, which we can obviously do a separate session on, that talks about the automation, operations, and troubleshooting of NSX-V and T as your day-to-day manager. And in that environment, there's a license level that gives you entitlement not only to ReSTNSX, but also to the MAT tool that we just showed you.
What's the most common use case where you see customers using ReSTNSX?
So from a ReSTNSX perspective, there's so many different use cases, it's hard to answer that question. But one of them being is a manager of managers. So that being, as you can see, we're logged into our NSX Manager here through the vCenter plugin. And our largest customer has 77 NSX Manager vCenter pairs. And imagine trying to manage those individually. Even the small customers make sense, right? Lab, production, East Coast, West Coast. If you're not using multi-site, even if you are using multi-site, there's value there. So that's one use case. Another one is delivering features that aren't even available in NSX. So for example, granular RBAC, right? We can do down to the object level permission, granting permission to an object of create, edit, delete, whatever it may be, with full governance wrapped around it, approval chains, reporting, object analysis, making sure that the environment is optimized from my rules to my stale objects. So again, it really fills out the suite of capabilities of not only V, but T and that migration in between.
Yeah, I love that. I love that RBAC feature you guys have, and that's really, really a nice add-on. I got another question here. Let's see. If we have an NSX-V and an NSX-T under the same vCenter, and we have security groups applied to the VMs, is it going to be a difference between the security group for NSX-V and the security group for NSX-T?
It absolutely is. So, when you think about how security is applied, let's take tagging as an example. If I tag a VM in NSX-V, and obviously the big limitation between moving from V to T is going to be that you can't have a host prepared for both at the same time. T can prepare an individual host, V it's at a cluster level. So an entire cluster can only be prepared for V, and one can only be prepared for T. So if I have two hosts, one in V and one in T, each one has a single VM on it. They both have a separate security tag. Let's say, security tag A versus security tag B. And each one of those tags is membership criteria for that security group or NS group in T. There's no way to create a rule that recognizes that tag between the two instances of NSX. When you migrate your hosts, you kind of have to do it when you're using security in groups that make sense from a security perspective. Now, what we do in ReSTNSX is we have a way to synchronize policy between different NSX managers. So we could actually make those rules equivalent. We could take security groups and synchronize the members into the form of IP sets, and insert that IP set into the remote security group. So we have a way to achieve that with ReSTNSX. But as far as any migration tool, whether it's ours or obviously if you're doing the migration tool that's built into NSXT, the migration coordinator, it's going to move all your hosts as part of the migration. You do have to be cognizant if you're doing a partial migration that you're moving VMs together as it relates to security. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think that answers a couple of questions there. So yeah, the next kind of a follow-up question, and I think you already answered it, is there intelligence built into ReSTNSX that will tag VMs and objects during the migration?
Absolutely. So we can tag VMs. One, we have a blanket tagging that you can put to all objects from specific data sources. Two, we're creating rules in our next version of MAT, which is due to be released here in the next 30 days, where you can add rules that say, hey, if this scenario, and you create the custom scenario, let's say, if you see something that's tagged with X, or VMs that start with this name, or VMs that are part of these security groups, or whatever else it might be, tag it. That allows you to actually migrate to your own security instead of saying, hey, you know what? I want to ditch all of this legacy security I was using in the past and go strictly tagging. We're going to create rules as part of the migration that allow you to move to that architecture into NSXT without having to do any legwork. So that is actually on the way, and there's a whole bunch of more intelligence wrapped around it that's being introduced in product.
Yeah, I have a kind of a follow-up question to that myself. So if we have a customer that has a lab or a dev environment, and they've got NSXT deployed, and they build out a bunch of firewall rules, and they're trying to make that be their true UAT environment for testing.
Yep.
Is there a way to then have my production T environment and then somehow allow me to either migrate or synchronize the rules between the two, assuming they're like true identicals? Like if I have a dev environment that's supposed to do exactly what my prod is and I want to validate and test it, is there some way ReSTNSX can help me take the rules from that test dev and then bring them into my production?
Yes, we can do that with ReSTNSX today. So we have a way to take rules from NSX-V and put them in NSXT, or even put them between V instances or between T instances and synchronize them. We've got customers that are doing that in production. With our largest customer has 77 different NSX managers. So you can imagine some of the synchronization they're doing. I mean, that stuff is beyond the scale of cross vCenter and other things. So they needed a product like ours to actually do synchronization between different groups of NSX managers. We can absolutely do that. So if that's something you wanted to take offline and get a demo for and show an example, we can absolutely do that as well.